Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed Podcast.
We are so grateful that you've tuned in. And Connor and I continue to receive affirmation that we believe is from the body of Christ and God's Spirit, that this is something that is resonating, and it's certainly blessing us. We've had several of you share our podcast with others, and so first of all, thank you so much for that. And if you would be willing to do that, to share this with those that in your world that may need it, and then also if you could do a review on iTunes or whatever service you tune in on, that would really bless us to be able to expand. We want this conversation to really come alongside the work of God in the church to be a blessing for this generation and every generation to come. Thank you for doing that.
Hey, so this episode will be a little bit different again this week. Thankfully, nobody got fired in the past 7 days. If you've been following along with us for any amount of time, you know that it's been our intention after every few episodes, we would take a podcast to just go back and answer some questions that came up about the subject that we were talking about, or just talk through some new aspects, some new revelations that have been uncovered through the scripture. So first, before we jump into some of the more textual questions, I speak for both my wife, Hannah, and I just want to say thank you to all of you. The response that we've received after our most recent podcast, this podcast got me fired, it's just been so life-giving and so incredible. When you go out onto a ledge with God, sometimes it feels like you're out there alone, and sometimes you have these fears and these worries that people are just going to look at you as crazy, and people are going to look at you as dumb and idiots and immature, and we have certainly felt all of that. But as we took this step out onto the ledge, we've just received so much love and so much support from so many of you who listened and just reached out to us in just a loving and kind manner. And so just from the bottom of my heart and Hannah's heart, we just want to say thank you for seeing us in this trial and just being there for us. So yeah, thank you.
That is awesome. And I love it when the body works. And God's church is going to last forever. But at times, I know everybody has the experience where the body of Christ doesn't work. And I can speak for myself. There are many times I don't work. And so when it does work like it's supposed to, it's just very encouraging.
So Jason, what is a question or a thought that has been raised?
So when you go back to our very first podcast, and where we talked about disciple making, a question that has been raised is, so are you advocating the blind leading the blind? And I think that comment comes from our conversation focus of saying that disciple making is a reciprocal experience. In other words, though there is a discernible discipler, somebody who's further on the journey, and the disciplee, that a disciple-making relationship, and the way I framed it is disciple-making, that word make is not in the Greek. It's, so we're in Matthew 28:18, 19 specifically, go and make disciples. It's go and disciple is what it really says there. And when you add make, that helps understand the verb, but it's not like making other things. It's not like making toast is the phrase I use, meaning you don't control the process. And I think the reason that's so important to me is every time I'd be in a position, I would put so much pressure on myself. I would stop trusting in God. I would say, how do I teach them? I would not admit I didn't know things. I would shut down honest questions. I would get more dogmatic. I had a student one time ask me, and I thought they were being a smart aleck, but they were sincere. They said, "Do you think you're God, Jason?" Bo Williams asked me that. Bo, if you're out there. And I thought, why would you ask me that, Bo? And then I was like, Bo, that is the best question ever. because I was taking the role of God, you know? And so we really want to dispel that thought that in order to disciple another person, you've got to have it together. I mean, Paul several times says, I'm the worst of sinners. And I think we blow it off because like, well, you're Paul, and that's just to make your point. But he really felt that. And yet he didn't shy away from saying, follow me as I follow Christ, because he wasn't saying following my perfection. He was saying, follow me as I learn too. It's not the blind leading the blind at all. It's two blind men following a man that can see is what's happening in discipleship.
When you talk about whether the word make is in there, for me, almost when I hear the word make, I think of like, maybe this just shows maybe how out of shape I am. I think of like baking like desserts. I think about making some sort of food. And I think there's this deep sense in some of us, a desire, honestly, for disciple making, for discipling to be kind of like a recipe, right? You add a cup of this, you add a cup of that, a splash of this, a dash of that, and boom, everything is going to be, you're going to have a disciple on your hands. You throw it in the oven for a little while, and boom, out pops, a nice Jesus dish. I think we talk about it so much because we just see that that's just not how life works.
Yeah, and it's not how Jesus worked. If we had this clear-cut thing that Jesus was following this step-by-step process, and I know authors will often do that. They'll take one interaction with Jesus and make a whole book out of it, and then I'm like, have you turned the page to the next story where Jesus doesn't do what you're advocating? And I'm not critical that what they're saying has some truth. It's the idea that this always applies. And I think I'd said this in the previous podcast. I know I've said, I just don't know where it falls. But the idea that Jesus often presented himself as what we would perceive as weak. Like if you hadn't read the Gospels, if you were just watching Jesus as a man, I think you'd ask yourself, why isn't he pushing back on this? Why is he being quiet? Like the thing I always go to is, why did Jesus never pull Judas aside and say, stop stealing from me?
Yeah.
And or stealing from the poor, which would even be more justified. Jesus never confronts Judas, as we know, with that kind of thing. And I think the whole dynamic there is he's presenting himself in ways that allow people to draw close. And understand, those two blind men that are being led are being given their sight. Every day I see more and more. But it's never about the discipler being in charge. It's about mutual submission with both.
To be a disciple is to be a learner. And so when you enter into a discipling relationship, it is two learners running after the Father. Even if there's a difference in life circumstances, experience, God is going to use those differences. God is going to use the age difference, the cultural difference, the gender difference to teach the other person something about himself. And that's the nature. That's why God made us all different, right? That's why we're not all gray blobs who only hang out with people who look exactly like us or have experienced exactly what we've experienced. Because when I look at somebody like Jason, who's much older than me, or Jason looks at somebody who's much younger than him, in that reality, God is trying to show each one of us something unique about himself.
Precisely. I mean, I think that is gold. And I think it applies to other questions that have come up, this dynamic of God is not asking us to become the expert. He's asking us to become more humble so that he can teach us through everything, and including these relationships we have. And I think this idea, it kind of reminds me of the discussion of the rich young ruler. In the rich young ruler, we've laid out the idea that Jesus is very precise in how he interacts with this young man who is at least physically humbling himself and is seeking good things. And we talked about the dynamic that Jesus went to the part where the man would have to submit, and the man walked away, and there is value in that, and because we extrapolated that to look at all these other times people walked away. I mean, if we were to go in the book of Acts, how many times did Paul bring people together and they walked away if they're not stoning him, or hurting him in some way?
Yeah.
And yet we feel that every interaction, if it doesn't have power, then we weren't pleasing to God. Let me go back. If it doesn't have the result we're looking for, it isn't pleasing to God. So my question would be, how do we apply the lessons of the rich young ruler to the person, here's a good word, that is recalcitrant, for the person that for whatever reason in our life, they're a family member, they're a coworker, and for whatever reason, there's still a pathway of communication between you, but everything you say relating to faith is like it's worse than hitting a brick wall. It's like a brick wall with fists. You feel like you get hit back. So how would you respond to that based on what we saw in the rich young ruler?
I think this is the heart of Amazed and Perplexed. Jesus was able to look at a person and live completely in the moment, and yet still see the long game.
Yeah, I think that's precision right there. That's a very precise answer. I struggle with the precise answer, but yeah, it is. It's the idea that it's funny how we'll displace things that Paul will write. We just plant and water. We if you sow, it's a result of somebody else's work. If you see the good result. And yet, especially when I was younger, you'd have preachers come in as like, this guy's baptized 50,000 people, as if he had planted and sown and caused the transformation himself, And I think it gave us this inappropriate perspective or inaccurate perspective of what our role is in the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
But it's seeing the person in the moment, doing the most loving thing, and letting God do that work, taking the pressure off us.
Well, for me, I used to work with teenagers, and a lot of the work of a youth minister, of a youth pastor, is setting up future success, right? Setting a base. And, obviously you hope for conversions and you hope for come to Jesus moments in the here and now. But a lot of the work you're doing is projecting forward and helping set them up for success. And I think ultimately, I think this is true for all ministers, honestly. A lot of times they're judged exactly here and now, right? Of how many people are you converting? How many people are you baptizing? And if we judge Jesus on that same scale, then he would be an abject failure.
Yeah, it's like a coach. People look at ministers as a coach. If a college coach, professional coach comes in, if they can't turn things around in a season or two, then they're out. And I think we kind of put that on us.
For sure. If this might be a very niche NBA reference, but you got to trust the process. Do you get that one?
I do.
I do get that one. You got to trust the process. Yes. Jesus might have known that this interaction was not going to go well in the here and now. And maybe he took the here and now loss for the benefit and the gain later. Another thought that was raised that we want to dive a little bit deeper into in our podcast on the prodigal sons, the two sons. So you have the younger son, right? He insults the father. He takes his inheritance and he gets lost in obscurity, and he squanders the wealth that he gets from the father. And then he comes back. The father welcomes him into the household. He throws a party. He puts the best robe on him, yada, yada, yada. You have the older son who has been with the father this entire time, who is bitter and angry that the younger son is getting all the stuff, is welcomed back into the family. And so much so that this older son refuses to participate in the party. And there's an aspect here, and especially, Jason and we're in the buckle of the Bible Belt, Tulsa, Oklahoma. There's an interesting idea here, and that's the idea of the art of getting lost and how sometimes being lost can be a benefit for you.
Yeah, so I can speak to it personally and then speak to it as a father, but personally, I was so disillusioned with church experience. By the time I was 16, I was still going to church but disconnecting, and it was probably a good solid 4 years that I really started to connect with God. And so there was a real coming back to me. And I want to be really clear. God can do anything he wants. And so when I talk to people that have had huge sin issues in their life, stuff that really put them into bad spots, they will often say, well, I don't know how I could have got here without that. Now, I want us to be clear. That's because the human imagination can't imagine it. God could have got any of us to where he needs us to be without our sin. So I want to be clear on that.
Yes.
That being said, God never lets hardship, whether we caused it or somebody else caused it, go to waste. He's redeeming everything. And I look back, and part of my perseverance in my faith has to do with those years of pushing back on God in every way I thought I could, Mm-hmm. And so that's really important. Now, so that's me as the prodigal.
I think this is a theme found throughout Scripture, right? And I'm going to steal this from Matt Chandler, the story of the Exodus, the story, like the exile of the Hebrew people, is God drawing his people out to draw them back to himself. And I think this is a direct aspect. Not to say that like God wanted the younger son to go and sin and get lost, but this is an aspect. God uses the brokenness of the world. He uses the aspects of the world that we would never even think that could be possibly used, and he uses those things to draw people back to himself.
Absolutely. And I think from the point of a father, so I'm working with my kids that are, I have a son that's 20 and a daughter that's 18, and watching them process their faith so differently than I did, and trying to come to terms with it. And I think a lot of how did Jesus raise his, quote, teenagers, the apostles, and how not heavy-handed he was most of the time. He's asking them questions. Now, we can put intonation into his words. Why do you not have faith in this? And we can make it, why do you not have faith? Or we can make it, why do you not have faith? So we have to be careful putting our own lens on it, depending on how we were taught. But the idea of freeing up God to do his work, that God loves my child so much more. Now, for the father in the story of the prodigal son, he is the father, so he's trusting himself and his spirit, and so it gets a little bit muddied there. But for me, putting myself in the position of my children resisting faith in any way, my role is to wait. Now, we'd have to go a little bit deeper, talk about contrasting Jesus going to get a single sheep. Why is he going, and yet the father's waiting? Now, the father runs, but he waits for the return of the son there. So there's nuance here to be considered. But in general, I think this idea of once you've given your children the best you can of your faith, that's not being perfect. It's just being on. Here's how this goes, and then those are seeds. That is water, and you stay available and you let them process. I'll give you an example of how this can go wrong. I heard a story not terribly long ago about a teenager coming to their parent and saying, I don't know if I believe in God. And the parent's response is, great parent. And the parent worked on it after that, but their first response was, you should stop taking communion right now then. And I understand that fear. I get that parent's response. And so when I do that kind of thing and knee-jerk, and I need to step back and say, wait a minute, God loves this person a billion times more than me. What's my role here? To offer truth, yes. But how do I want to be treated if I'm struggling with something?
Yes.
Another thought that was shared with us by Linda Scott was the idea when we were talking about turning water to wine is God's creativity. And there's creativity and then there's creativity. And I wish I could say it better, creativity and creativity. This idea that it's beyond my sense if you have an incredibly artistic person that can see something before it exists, which I don't have that spatial intelligence, but that's a marvel. But to think God has that exponentially more, and to be able to come alongside us like he did Jesus for this man who was in this really precarious situation and produce something that had never been, that is an amazing thing to add to your view of life.
Well, when you talk about art, it's one of the fundamental things that separates humans from all their creatures on earth. And I know for me, and maybe this is the faith that I inherited, or just where we find ourselves in our modern day, people tend to gravitate towards one aspect of God, right? They gravitate towards his creativity, his artistic side, because God does have a very artistic side. Or we tend to gravitate towards the brilliant, I'll say the intellectual brilliance of God. And I think part of this tension, right, is baked into the cake, right? The fact that he made us all unique and individuals, and he gave us all our own predispositions to, be an artist, or, have chicken scratch handwriting, or whatever the thing may be. This is baked into the cake, but it's a good challenge for us, right? If I find myself drifting more to the intellectual side of things, and I struggle to understand the creativity, the artistic side of God, I need to be intentionally putting myself in positions to marvel and wonder at the artistic side of God.
Absolutely. I love that. And I'm reminded, somebody wrote a long time ago, maybe Francis of Assisi or somebody else that I wouldn't remember, but he just has this long list of these different aspects of God. And the one that stands out is, how can he be all just and all merciful?
Yes.
And so how can he be totally artistic and yet very ordered?
Mm-hmm.
And he is both. And that's when, as we start to take that in and whatever words resonate with you, then you start to look at life differently. You really start to move into the wonder of walking with the living God.
Yeah, and I think this is really important, right? Because a lot of times we kind of like we latch on to whatever aspect of God really speaks to us, and we get really excited about that one thing. And when somebody introduces this other aspect or wants to explore it or talk about it, it makes us feel uncomfortable because we're going to have to maybe loosen our grip a little, or we're going to have to expand our grip and take in more aspects. Here's the thing about wonder. Wonder doesn't come from a fist, it comes from an open hand. And if we want to experience the wonder and the awe of who God is, it has to come at the expense of comfortability. If you listen to last week's episode where we discussed my firing and we discussed our second episode, The Opportunity of Doubt, we had mentioned in that episode that we were going to talk about belief and faith and what the Bible has to say about that. And so that's what we're going to do right now.
So I just want to acknowledge and make sure we're on the same page here. Number one, English translations of any language or any translation into another language, you have to be probably 90% of the New Testament is pretty cut and dry. It's pretty simple. But then there's another 10% that you really do have to dig down into the language, and part of that is how different words are translated. So you could have a word, take doubt, for example. You could have the word doubt in multiple contexts, and I'm not a Greek expert. I mean, if you've had basic Greek classes, this is common ground. But you have to dig in. What is this word actually meaning? Just because it says doubt in English doesn't mean it's the same word as doubt on this other page. The other thing is context. That we have a history that is not done well, in my experience, in my reading, of putting things in context. Well, proof text, that's where you take a verse out of the context, and then you can make it say whatever you want. And so this is the thing that we are fighting with, even within ourselves, because if you're familiar with the wineskins example of new wine, as Jesus pours new wine into me, as his Spirit gives me new stuff, I sometimes cringe. And so this is the work that we're having to do with this. And that's why we want to be a disciple, a learner. But the word doubt, in my understanding, as I read through it, there are four main words that come out, four main Greek words that come out, and three of them are similar. You have the word distasso, which when translated like standing in two places trying to figure it out, or diakrino, which is often translated judging or distinguishing. It's trying to see both sides of it. And all three have that. And then there's another word called apistos, which pistos is the word for faith. Belief and faith are the same Greek word, pistos. Apistos means against faith. And that's a very different feel than the other three words. So when Jesus calls people to have more faith, or take James, in James 1:6, where it talks about the dynamic of when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. That dynamic there, number one, it's in a context. He's being very specific, ask for wisdom. But when you ask, you need to be trusting in God, asking for that. This is not suggesting that James never had doubt. He's saying, I need to be in a right frame to ask, because if I'm asking, I'm not all over the place. I need to be somewhat centered in that moment, versus Thomas, which is apistos, where Thomas refuses to believe despite the eyewitness testimony, and he says, stop doubting and believe. He's saying, stop being against faith. Choose this. Now, here's what's interesting. It's not a condemnation for his doubt. He's saying, look, I have the evidence for you. And Thomas's response is immediately, my Lord and my God, And this is the dynamic is, the bigger issue is we think God is uncomfortable with our belief, but Jesus isn't uncomfortable with his belief. He's saying, look, I can fix that. And that's the whole spirit that we're trying to say is, we're not saying you should invest in doubt, spend a lot of time doubting, find new ways to doubt. That's not what we're saying. We're saying when you have doubt, and I don't know a Christian I've had a conversation with that won't admit that if we have a safe, honest relationship, you not acknowledging it actually hurts the process. It's like going to a doctor and not telling him your symptoms and saying, fix me.
Yeah. So I think for all of us, right, most people in the sound of my voice right now, the goal, right, is to grow into a deeper relationship with God, to know him better, to know him more, and to let his spirit transform us. So the word pistos, actually, like the Greek, many scholars will argue that a better translation is trust in God. And the thing about trust is oftentimes when we think about the gospel, when we think about church, when we think about all this religious stuff, it's really easy for us to begin to trust in the what. It's really easy for us to begin to trust in the knowledge, the words, the way we have done things our entire life, or the way that our parents have done things their entire life. And I think this is a continual invitation that is being offered in the Jesus story. It's to rely on the who and not on the what. The what is incredibly important, right? The Bible speaks a lot about the what issues. But ultimately, if they're not connected to the who, if that trust in the what isn't connected to the trust in the who, then it's ultimately meaningless and really not that important to our lives.
Absolutely. The other thing I want to point out is the difference between the words proscriptive and descriptive. And proscriptive is what should happen, and descriptive is what is happening. And I first noticed this when I was studying the Proverbs, where, for example, it says, it's better to sleep on the edge of your roof than to be in a house with a bitter wife or something like that. Solomon isn't saying, oh, that's the ideal marriage. He's just describing there. But there are other things that are proscriptive. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your understanding. He knows that you're not always going to trust in the Lord with all your heart.
Yeah.
But he's saying this is what you should be doing. So you have to, when you're reading the Proverbs, you have to first ask, is this descriptive? This is a truth about how things happen, or is it proscriptive? And a lot of times we pick up that in the New Testament by what the people, and the Old Testament, by what the people actually do. Abraham is the father of our faith, and yet he is a man that is chronicled as doubting. Mm-hmm. When Abraham says to Sarai, I will sleep with Hagar, he is doubting God's ability to provide there. When God tells him, it says in Romans 4 that he had a fact-facing faith, that he would say, man, I don't, her womb is dead, but I'm going to choose to believe. So he had doubt, this idea of being double-sided. The other thing that really pops up, and where this broke free for me, was Matthew 28:17. Jesus about to deliver the Great Commission. It says they, the 11, Judas is dead, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And that word there is it's distasso. It's wanting to have your cake and eat it too, uncertain at a crossroad because refusing to choose one way over the other. So here these apostles, I don't know how many, there's some, more than a couple, and they're looking at Jesus. He's raised, he's already shown, and Thomas, they've already been through the experience of Thomas doubting, and they're on the way to his ascension where he's going to deliver the Great Commission, and it says they were doubting at that time, and if I were Jesus, I would say, stop, this is stupid, you're out, all the doubters leave, and yet he gives them all the Great Commission. Jesus is not uncomfortable with our doubt as long as we keep moving towards him. Now, there's a difference between what they're experiencing and saying, I refuse to believe.
Yeah.
And that's I think, sometimes when you hear this word, you've got to really be a listener when somebody says, I struggle with doubt, or I doubt, or I struggle with faith, to really discern what is are you just resistant to God? Because that's a different conversation than there's just this gap between my understanding and I don't know how to process it. Well, that's every person in the Bible.
Well, I mean, and, speaking personally for Hannah and I, what ended up getting us fired, like, at times have I struggled with unbelief and have I struggled with these things? Absolutely. But each and every time I answer that unbelief with, okay, God, I'm not sure, but I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust you in this doubt. I'm going to trust you in this unbelief. And I think that is what I think Jesus is after. One thing that I would just add, maybe this is helpful for you and maybe it's not. When we talk about the people in the Bible who struggled with doubt or struggled with unbelief or struggled with accepting who Jesus said he was, there's a really easy tendency to project ourselves back on them. And it's really important to remember that, yes, there are things that we can directly apply to us that happen to them, but we live in an entirely different culture, an entirely different society at an entirely different time. You look at the main reasons for why people don't believe or people outright reject God, and whether it's science or the problem of evil, whatever the issue may be, most of the issues that most people have for why they say they don't believe in God would not have been any issue at all for somebody 2,000 years ago. And so when we try to there's so many layers to this. It's not simple. When we try to project back 2,000 years ago and we go through the Greek, we're not just like trying to get the right translation. We're also trying to put ourselves back into the shoes of a first century, Roman occupied Palestinian man or woman, and that's incredibly difficult.
To speak to your point, it shocked me when I started looking in the Gospels and Acts, or even in the letters, for apologetic arguments. And there are very few. When you have things like, even when they're referencing God created the heavens and the earth, they're not saying that mostly to non-believers. They're saying it to encourage each other. Why don't you have a bunch of apologetics lessons? And I'm a fan of apologetics, but why don't you have that? Well, they didn't need that. These were people that the vast majority were monotheistic. Now, when you cross over, specifically with Paul's ministry, he starts to make different appeals to different audiences, and there's a good lesson in that for us too. But even still, it's not convincing people that there is a God. It's convincing people there's only one God. Yeah. And so you'll start with where it is. Now, here's the question that kind of grows from that. Well, then, my goodness, if there's so much difference in their methodologies, and there is, and that's a whole other line of thinking, then how am I supposed to connect with this generation? And my answer is, now you're talking. Because it's when we start not assuming we know, but asking God. So right now we're in the middle of the coronavirus, and right now we're in the middle of a lot of racial upheaval, and we all have different perspectives on how much is right and how much is too much. But God is ready for this. Our job isn't to say, well, here's all I've learned, and so now I'm making my summary judgment. It's, God, give me eyes to see and ears to hear so that you can heal me, so I can provide healing to others. And that's honestly what we hope Amazed and Perplexed helps us do. Is that dynamic of saying, when I open up space to be amazed and perplexed, in contrast to how I used to, I just need to read the Bible because we're reading the Bible and I got to figure out my arguments and I got to be able to say I read the Bible today. But to be able to rest and say, man, I'm amazed by this, I'm perplexed by this, and then you take the next step and you share that with God and you ask God. And you get in a conversation with God to allow Him to teach you. And the more you learn, the more you're going to have an appetite to learn. The more you see, the more you're going to have an appetite to see. And that's what we want to stir, certainly among us and among any that this will bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Amazed and Perplexed Podcast. Going on into the future, we would love for you to be a part of these wrap-up kind of episodes, these question and response episodes. And so as we go forward into the next few weeks, as you listen to our podcast, we would just encourage you, if you see something that you hear something that you think is interesting, write it down, send it to us. We would love to dive deeper into your questions, into your thoughts. Please join us next time as we dive into the topic of death and how does Jesus view death. Grace, peace, and love.